t'aime, Bruxelles, je t'aime. Tu m'avais manqué, Bruxelles, je t'aime, Bruxelles, je t'aime. T'es ma préférée, Bruxelles, je t'aime, Bruxelles, je t'aime.
Hi there, welcome to Brussels, My Love, Euronews' weekly talk show that reflects back on the news of the week. I'm Maeve McMahon. Thank you so much for tuning in. Coming up this weekend, world leaders flocked to the most exciting city in the world to discuss the most disturbing issues of our time. The 79th UN General Assembly took place in New York as Israel hammered southern Lebanon, killing hundreds and displacing thousands. We take a look at the role of the European Union in these talks and ask how we can future-proof Europe in this unstable world. And aspiring EU member state Serbia has reintroduced compulsory military service. All Serbian men will have to undertake 60 days of training and 15 days of exercises. Women can opt in. The measure certainly seems like a blast from the past. We're asking if it is out of line in modern Europe. Let's bring in our panel this week. Virginijus Sinkevičius, Lithuanian MEP from the Greens, well known for being a former EU Commissioner. Good to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
Great. Maria Martisiuti, a security and defence analyst from the European Policy Centre.
Thank you for having me.
And Matthew Robinson, the director of the Euro-Gulf Information Centre.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming. But as usual, before we bring in your analysis and your opinions, let's just hear what was on Brussels' mind this week.
With war raging in Europe's neighbourhood in the East and Middle East, Brussels is worried there is no end in sight. Following the quasi-elimination of the terrorist group Hamas, Israel has now set its sights on Hezbollah, the pro-Iranian militia in Lebanon. But the EU is more divided than ever. Everyone has their own position on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is not the case with the war in Ukraine. Here, Western support seems unwavering. EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen visited Kiev last week, offering billions in loans. But with elections imminent in the US and a European Commission on hold pending approval, the future is uncertain and the challenges for the coming term will be immense.
So a pretty dangerous situation unfolding there, and it looks like Israel is even bracing for a ground offensive to put actual boots on the ground in Lebanon. What has the view here been from Brussels on this escalation?
Well, I think this is an issue comparing war in Ukraine, which is probably sort of was in the center for a very long and has huge consequences the way it's going to end on the EU. Here you find EU split, and I think that's the biggest sort of danger, where you find huge split among member states on the position, on finding the right tone, how to deal with the issue. And I think that's been quite for some time with the EU, and that pressure is increasing. On the other hand, it shows that we are unable to find the right tone, the right attitude to deal with it. And new commission, when it's going to be finally in place with Kaja Kallas, that's an opportunity to sort of turn page. But I wouldn't put so much hopes only on the commission, because my worry is that we have very little stability in the governments across the biggest member states.
Indeed. And you say the EU is very split. The EU has also been applying double standards, perhaps, in the two various wars. But we'll come back to that, because I want to stick on this topic of the situation in Lebanon, because we saw in New York as well, Josep Borrell, he was over there. There was a foreign affairs ministers meeting taking place on the sidelines, and Borrell was saying the situation is extremely dangerous, extremely worrying. We're almost in a full-fledged war. He said, if it's not a war situation, I don't know what you would call it. Matthew, what would you call it?
Well, I think one thing should be said. I think it's important to underline Israel does have the right to self-defense within the accordance of international law. I hope the hostages are returned as soon as possible. I can't imagine what some of the families, both in Israel and the Palestinian people, are going through in Gaza. But the nightmare scenario is the spillover effect into a region-wide conflict, whether it's the Houthis disrupting major shipping routes that have a knock-on effect to us here in Europe, Iranian proxies everywhere in the region. We've seen that first and foremost in Lebanon with Hezbollah. But I think it is concerning that Netanyahu is starting to position, I called up reserves, a potential ground effort over the border into Lebanon. That is concerning, but I think world leaders also need to exercise discretion and responsibility as it relates to some of their comments. I saw on the sidelines, the UN General Assembly, the president of Turkey, Erdogan, couldn't even condemn Hamas as a terrorist organization, defended Hamas and the resistance effort. And NATO member, I think that was an outrageous comment.
You can almost feel the tension in the room from here. But as it stands, we have seen a statement. As we're taping this show, a statement has been put out. The EU, the Saudis, the Japanese, all together calling for a ceasefire as soon as possible. Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General, saying that Lebanon was on the brink of becoming a second Gaza, that this was a non-stop nightmare. Maria, Matthew alluded there to the consequences this could have on the European Union. Is the EU ready for this?
Well, I think the starting point is to recognise that we live in times of war and aggression, with two wars on his doorstep, with more assertive China and Iran, North Korea propping Russia. I think the expectation of the new EU leadership, the expectations are really high, to be bold, to be courageous, as Matthew says, to come and, label and use the right words for the actual actions that are happening. And I think what's important is to learn lessons. And when it comes to, in particular, Russia's war against Ukraine, I mean, we deeply misunderstood Russia. And I think this is the kind of attitude we should approach the Middle East crisis with. And we hugely underestimated the importance of Ukraine to the European and Euro-Atlantic peace and security. So I think the sooner we recognise this, the sooner we are prepared to try to forge common positions and recognise this, the sooner it will be resolved.
So huge responsibility on the shoulders of those coming into the Commission and also in our capitals. And as you say, it's a pretty shaky scene across the capitals right now.
Exactly. I think the issue that we sometimes put, especially being here in Brussels bubble, we sometimes put too much of hopes and expectations on the new cabinet coming in, because if you look at
because you were a commissioner, so you know exactly.
If you look at the treaties, you look at defense, you look at foreign policy, there is not so much place for maneuver for the incoming new cabinet unless they have a support from the member states. That support can be in various terms. The most important is, of course, when capitals speaking in a single voice. And if you look where we were successful, that's where the Commission had a support from the biggest capitals and managed to speak in a single voice. So I think, as I said, Kaja Kallas will be a possibility for a new page. We know that she is outspoken. She is not afraid to have a position, but it's going to be extremely important not to be embarrassed with that position, to have a backing from the capitals. And then you look at Paris. I know Michel Barnier very well. We worked on Brexit for quite some time, until the last minutes of Brexit. He's a great operator, well experienced, but then his backing in National Assembly
and he needs to fix France first. He's got a lot of issues on his shoulders. But you just mentioned Kaja Kallas. Just to remind our viewers, she's tipped to be the next EU Foreign Affairs Chief to take over from Josep Borrell. She's currently preparing for her hearing, where MEPs will have to give her the green light. But I just wanted to mention as well that this week European Affairs Ministers were in town discussing all these issues, and we actually had the chance to speak to the Irish Minister of State for European Affairs, Jennifer Carroll McNeill, to get her view on how to de-escalate the situation in the Middle East.
The Palestinian Authority, there needs to be an authority that can genuinely represent the Palestinian people. That is not Hamas, in my view, not a terrorist organisation, but a legitimate authority that is capable of representing the people, Palestinian people. Ireland, of course, has recognised Palestine as a state, but it is going to need to build that state.
The Irish Minister of State for European Affairs, they're making the point, reiterating that Ireland, of course, recognised Palestine as a state back in May. Spain also did the same. They did that together, meaning that almost 10 of the EU member states have recognised the Palestinian state. The question now is, how can the European Union participate in building this future state, Maria, in Palestine, or should it do so at all?
Well, I think the willpower, as Virginia is saying, will be very important, the willpower of member states. But at the same time, we need to recognise that there might be limits to what we can achieve. And I do not see a way out unless we start the discussions and preparations for two-state solution. I just do not see it. And when you see the world leaders take the floor and address the General Assembly, I mean, this is where the overwhelming support of the world is. So I think we have to come and sit at the table, and this is decades-long question.
Decades-long question.
And I think
deeply complex.
Yes, and I think there has to be a breakthrough.
Is that ever possible?
Yeah, I think it's been disappointing that you've seen a backtracking of the Likud party on their previous commitments to a two-state solution. I mean, Europe has a track record for being a good partner in peace. You had the Irish minister there. The EU was a key partner in the Good Friday peace process in Northern Ireland. Different circumstances for sure. But in terms of diplomatic personnel, the Americans have, over the years, quite often duplicated some of the personnel they put in Northern Ireland, now put into the Israeli and Palestinian conflict. I think we need a redoubling of our commitments there with the Arab partners in the region, with the Arab Gulf. I think Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Bahrain all have a key role in that region. Qatar has played an important role as a mediator, but we need to put an emphasis on interfaith dialogue in the region. When the dust settles, and I hope it does, we need to use that, what has been a disastrous situation, and use the darkness from that and try and find a little bit of light and build on a two-state solution. But it will require a moderate and reasonable Palestinian Authority and a reasonable Israeli government that's sadly at the moment been dragged too often to the right-wing fringes.
Well, that's why we saw as well Erdogan, the Turkish president, calling Benjamin Netanyahu there, comparing him to Adolf Hitler. Maybe it was a step too far there, but I'm sure there's lots of efforts behind the scenes there at the UN to find a solution. But of course, it will take a lot of time. But just going back to the Ukraine-Russia war, of course, it's much closer to us here as well in Brussels. We saw the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in the United States this week. He was meeting President Joe Biden. He was presenting his victory plan. And earlier in the week, he also paid a visit to an ammunition plant in Pennsylvania. He's, of course, looking for military aid, and he wants the green light to use Western weapons inside Russia. And while he was at that plant, he used the opportunity to thank all the workers there for his support. We can take a listen.
You said that 400 people work here, but I wanted very much to come here and to thank you. 400 people saved millions of Ukrainians. Because of the result of your work, I'm very thankful, just from ordinary Ukrainians to you. And what can I say? Thank you so much. You helped us to survive against Putin invasion.
Ukraine's President Zelensky there. Maria, to what extent does his future really and the support for his country depend on these elections coming up in the United States?
Oh, very much. It's absolutely vital and important because elections in the United States will fundamentally shape the course of war in Ukraine. I'm very pleased to see that he arrived in the United States and he was there in Pennsylvania connecting to the electorate because it's very important that the American population, who are the key stakeholders in this election, hear firsthand from the leader who is fighting for Europe's security and freedom, hear from them what it's like and what the stakes are.
And he's good at that, no? I mean, President Zelensky is good at messaging.
Yes, but I think, we are a bit in this war situation quite for some time. And, looking at the US elections, I think, for Europe, we really don't have much choice in any of the scenario which will end up, we still have to do utmost to support Ukraine. And we have to answer the question very clearly. Do we keep on helping Ukraine to survive, or we help Ukraine to win? Because there is a huge difference between keeping you survival mode and helping you to win. And I think we haven't bridged that yet. We are not helping Ukraine enough to win this war. And for Europe, it doesn't matter really, the elections in the US, because consequently, this war will have enormous consequences for Europe and for the US as well. If your US want to keep its firm ally, democracy and human rights defender stable, it has to do utmost as well to support Ukraine. And the same goes to your previous question about if Europe has to be there for two-state solution for Gaza.
Let's Ukraine, because I also want to talk about how Ursula von der Leyen, the president, she went to Kyiv last week. It's her 8th trip. I mean, how many more trips will she have to make?
Well, I think it's important that the President of the Commission was seen there. I mean, ultimately, she's got a tough task in her hand at home here in Europe to get her own commission over the line over the next few months. But I think working with our American partners is going to be key. There was a lot to unpack at that Zelensky trip. I don't think it was a coincidence that that press conference happened in the swingiest of swing states, Pennsylvania, that will arguably determine the outcome of the election. I think there's been too much emphasis on the European side as it relates to Ukraine on who will win the presidential race, whether it's Kamala Harris or Donald Trump.
They have no luxury to choose.
The Congress controls the purse strings as it relates to spending in Ukraine, and all indications are looking that the Republicans will probably win back the Senate, maybe even hold on to the House. Vice President Harris could win this election, but if she has a Republican-controlled Congress in her face that is becoming growingly skeptical about this war, it's going to be difficult to keep appropriating funds for Ukraine, and that will have a knock-on effect to Europe. What does that mean for the European Commission for Ursula von der Leyen? It might mean Europe having to step up more money in a time in which, domestically speaking, so many budgets are being squeezed here at home in Europe.
And of course, Ursula von der Leyen, Maria, when she visited Kyiv there last week, she announced this 35 billion loan that would be backed, of course, with windfall profits from frozen Russian assets. Will this really help?
Well, at the moment, 80% of Ukraine's infrastructure is destroyed by Russia. So, of course, the 35 billion, which comes from, the mobilized Russian assets, is absolutely vital, as well as smaller contributions such as from the Netherlands or Denmark. But what's striking for me is that, we are 2 years and a half after the full-scale invasion. We are 10 years since annexation of Crimea and the invasion of Donbass. And we are still late, and we are still slow, and it's still not enough. And even worse, we are drawing red lines for ourselves that, undermine Ukraine's right to self-defense. And of course, I'm referring here to the, restrictions with regard to long-range missiles that can strike Russia. And after such a long time, it's really time to be talking about victory, which is totally missing from NATO's communiques. There's no word victory among Western leaders. It's missing from the vocabulary of the European leaders.
I think
another thing missing is
the leaders. They are just afraid that Russia can lose this war. That's the biggest problem. What I see in their language is they always those key words are missing because they're just afraid that Russia might lose this war.
It's true, they're guided by fear, but at this stage, for me, this is abdication of responsibility. And this is why I have high expectations of the current leadership and the choices that President von der Leyen made to have a breakthrough and to speak about victory, to envision it, to prepare also our populations for what might come.
But it does look like it's not exactly around the corner, Matthew.
Yeah, and we've seen a lot of volatility at home. And you correctly referenced France and some of the whether it's France, the Netherlands,
Germany,
Germany. You have seen populist elements, and these make for difficult parliamentary majorities. It puts huge pressure on governments, and I think it is the longer this conflict goes on, and I think there is broad unity amongst most well-thinking people in Europe, of course, we want to see Ukraine come out on top of this conflict. Okay. But support is going to start to wane in certain capitals the longer this conflict goes on.
Sure. Well, on that point, we can close this conversation. Stay with us here, though, on Euronews, because after the break, we'll be hearing how Serbia will be calling on all men to learn how to fight 14 years after military service was actually scrapped. See you soon. Welcome back to Brussels, my love. I'm Maeve McMahon, and along with our panel, we're talking through the news of the week. And one that we're following brings us to Belgrade, where the government has brought in a new rule from the past and will be calling on all young men to do compulsory military service. Croatia's also toying with the idea too, as the reality is our armed forces in Europe are not really ready for potential war. Is this a good idea, Maria?
This is a very welcome idea and highly overdue. It will not be easy to transition from peacetime to wartime, so to say. But considering that Norwegian, Swedish, British, German, Polish authorities do not exclude an attack on NATO and the EU before 2030, how else will we fulfill Article 5 or EU Treaties Article 42.7? Whom are we going to draw on? So I think it's important to have those difficult conversations with the populations. It's important for the member states to start discussing this and draw on best models. Sweden is one, for example. That
serious wake-up call there, serious words coming from yourself, Maria. And as you say, this is already in a number of member states. They already have compulsory military service. You can see there in blue, we have countries that have recently announced the introduction of compulsory military service, like Croatia and Serbia. And then in orange there, countries where conscription already exists, with, of course, different military service models like Turkey, Greece and Cyprus, but also Switzerland and Austria. And then, of course, the Scandinavian countries, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Estonia, the Baltics, Latvia, Lithuania, and then in yellow there, the Netherlands and Germany, which have also shown interest in this so-called Swedish model, which would focus on selective conscription. It's interesting when you look at the map there geographically, though, where this policy is being introduced and where not.
Yeah, I think it's quite a creative idea. And by the way, in the British general election, interestingly, the Conservative Party floated a similar idea going into the election of trying to encourage young people once they leave school to have some form of military service with opt-out. It's worth saying that you could opt out into the voluntary sector. But I think for bigger European countries, while I think it's a good idea, there are logistical problems here. I mean, I don't know how big countries could stretch their resources to be able to cope with it. I think we need to look also to our friends across the pond in the US with ideas like the Peace Corps. There are ways you can involve citizens beyond the military that actually give them a sense of national belonging. And I think we need to look at all of them.
Oh, I think it's a fair point, which many is forgetting. On one hand, clearly, when the society acceptance is high, it's way easier to reintroduce it. But on the other hand, you also have to have an infrastructure. And living for so many years within sort of peace conditions and pushing war talks maybe into NATO meetings or certain security councils, but really not taking it seriously. I think most of the infrastructure is not there. And actually, you've mentioned Lithuania on that map. In Lithuania, we have a model which is mixed. So you have a conscription only of those if you don't fulfill the quota. The yearly quota, if it's not fulfilled by voluntary, then you have sort of a lottery conscription. Why is that? It's just because infrastructure is not there yet. So we are increasingly building infrastructure, but it's not there yet. And I think many NATO countries, EU countries are going to be meeting the same thing. So actually here, having a commissioner responsible for defense might have a little bit a different turn in sort of bridging the member states and having EU vision as regards defence.
And we will have a European Commissioner for Defence, Andrius Kubilius, from your country, former Prime Minister, Lithuanian. He will be appointed that job if, of course, he passes his grilling, but...
He will pass. He will pass.
He will pass.
No, he's definitely well experienced, and I think a great choice. What I'm disappointed in is his bit of mission letter, which is very puzzling. He's sort of working a lot with Kaja Kallas, but then he's under the responsibility of Finnish vice president, where I think if we take defense as a priority, I would move defense portfolio directly under the Commission president.
Indeed. And just, we wanted to actually speak to young people as well here in Brussels to see how they would feel if they were forced to go to the army. So we took our mics to the streets. You can take a look.
I would do it. Just it depends how much time, for how long. But if the country really need me, I would go, yes.
There's a lot of things to do to prepare for the job market nowadays, and so I don't think going to training for military purposes is one of them.
I won't agree because I feel like it's a choice for anyone to do it if they want to, and I have to study, I have other things to do in my life, so no, I won't.
Il faudrait sans doute effectivement conscientiser les jeunes à cette...
We would probably need to raise awareness about these issues, but without emphasizing the safety aspect of it, because we know where that can lead to.
Tourner vers l'aspect sécuritaire, parce qu'on sait vers quoi ça peut mener.
So different reactions there, yes. Some saying they're too busy with their lives.
Well, I think indeed it's time to have those conversations and also to link it to the benefits that the youth would have, to link it to the dialogue about security and freedom, but also to make it, look as a socially responsible thing to do.
How do we tell a 21-year-old who's dealing with a lot of issues, they want to study, and they feel they've been only in peace times, they haven't seen war?
I think we should also look to school. There's some European countries where school children are encouraged into the cadet forces at a younger age. That's another creative way to do it, trying to instill a bit of interest in service while they're still in school, without forcing
From what age?
From, I think, as certainly my experience when I was at school, I did the cadets from about age 14 through to 18. And I think that's a good balance to encourage children at that younger age without forcing them full throttle into conscription.
Well, I think it's a big division. You know, for us, being from the Baltic countries, it's a completely different conversation, because we still remember what has happened, that 30 years ago we didn't have these rights for a free speech. We didn't have a right of freely travel, study where you want, and all that has been fought very hardly by our parents and grandparents. So in Lithuania, it's a bit of a different conversation rather than in the rest of Europe. But I think it's also a bit of society acceptance, how the army is shown. If it's shown, publicly that it doesn't give you anything, then of course it's going to be a different to sell. While in Lithuania, I think it's a bit a different case now.
And on that point, we can conclude that very interesting conversation. Thank you so much to our panel for being with us this weekend. And thank you so much for watching. Take care and see you soon. Welcome back to Brussels, my love. I'm Maeve McMahon, and along with my panel, we're just taking a look back at the news of the week. And one that had us talking was this: the UN General Assembly that has almost become a Davos for global diplomacy. World leaders spent the week taking pictures in Manhattan, and Joe Biden gave his last major foreign policy speech. Leaders also signed a pact for the future to bring about a more fit-for-purpose UN. Antonio Guterres called for serious change and outlined the very urgent to-do list.
Reform of the outdated United Nations Security Council to make it more effective, but also more representative of what the world is today, and reform how we respond to complex global shocks and work together on peace and security.
So Antonio Guterres there, sounding a bit like a broken record. I mean, we've heard that before, but is it possible to push ahead with these reforms, Maria?
Well, it's a long-standing issue, and I think it's quite telling that indeed there is a chapter on reform of Security Council within this pact for the future. I think it's important. Where the problem, I think, lies is that there is no agreement how to go about it.
Yeah, lots of lofty ideas and statements, but
I just, sometimes also wonder, haven't we crossed the threshold in terms of, the types of wars we're having? And it's a war in Ukraine, it's a war in the Middle East, but also, civil wars in Sudan or Democratic Republic of Congo. Haven't we passed the threshold that we saw the League of Nations coming to, gradual decline and ultimate demise. And, it would be easy, of course, to fix the current structures, to reconstruct the UN Security Council. But, the choice is ours to make.
Well, you mentioned Sudan as well, civil war going on there that hardly gets a mention even in the media, completely forgotten about. But Moscow and Iran opposed that pact for the future. Can we just accept that multilateralism is failing?
I don't think we should. I think it's fair to say that multilateralism has been under severe strain. I think over the last decade, whether it's populist movement, whether it was Trump's election or Brexit, you have seen a pushback to some quasi-nationalism. But I think these institutions, while broken for sure, are important. And what I worry about in the last few years, I think certain, whether it's European countries, the US, have vacated an element of leadership in some of these core international institutions, bodies off the UN. I mean, you lose track of how there's so many good agencies doing good work, whether it's the World Food Programme as well, that, you look at all these conflicts, food shortages and sustainability is such a huge issue. I think it requires root and branch reform of all of these UN agencies. It's a mammoth task, but it's important that it's done, and it'll require leadership from Europe and from the United States.
And indeed, a lot in that document to address the Paris Agreement, the goals of the Paris Agreement, women's rights. I think Antonio Guterres, he was disgusted as well with the lack of women at the UN General Assembly as well this week.
I think that also, something Europe also needs to learn. President von der Leyen call for a gender balance commission was basically ignored by the capitals, and it's hard to imagine that we cannot find 14 women being able to lead within the commission. So there is definitely space for improvement. But overall, looking at that reform, I think there is always, two difficulties. First of all, everyone comes at the table with their own problems, not really looking into something what we need to give in. Even with that pact, you could see, Russia trying to push certain things, and they were dismissed. So it shows that multilateralism is still important, is still working. Nobody wants to accept sort of the rule that bigger country can just, on a made-up reason, occupy the territories of the other. But then when it comes to the details, that's where the problem starts, that everyone starts to rowing their own direction. And then the institutions, it's always, every reform is about people, and those people, unfortunately, sometimes not willing to reform themselves.
Okay, and on that conclusion, we can bring this conversation to an end. Thank you so much to our guests this weekend, Virginijus Sinkevicius, the Green MEP, Maria Martinciuti and Matthew Robinson. Thank you so much for your insights, and thank you so much to you for watching. If you have any comments or topics you'd like us to discuss, please reach out. Our email address is brusselsmylove@euronews.com. We're also on social media, so you can send us a DM. But for now, take care and see you soon.